So, everyone was waiting for this massive release of documents about Jeffrey Epstein, thinking it would finally bring some clarity, right? Well, it turns out it's done the complete opposite. It's left survivors, lawmakers, and pretty much everyone else with way more questions than answers. So, let's dive into what's going on and figure out what these files really tell us, and maybe more importantly, what they don't.
Okay, the first thing you have to wrap your head around is the sheer scale of what we are not seeing. The Department of Justice released 3 million pages of files. That sounds like a lot, but it's only half the story. There's another 3 million pages. Yep, a full 50% that are still totally hidden from public view. This one fact is really at the heart of all the frustration.
All right, so here's a quick look at what we're going to break down. We'll start with the document drop itself, then get into former President Trump's pretty wild reaction. After that, we'll look at the bigger picture, the unseen network, and the DOJ's official call on all this. Then we'll hear the powerful response from survivors, and finally touch on the growing demand for some independent oversight.
Let's get right into the nuts and bolts of this release. I mean, when you only give people half the information in a case this explosive, it's pretty much guaranteed to create a firestorm. And that is exactly what happened.
Just think about that number for a second. 6 million pages. That is a mountain of information. For investigators, that's a monumental task. But for the public, trying to piece together a story from that much data is nearly impossible, especially when you don't have all the pieces. And this is the part that just keeps coming up again and again. You see all the headlines about this huge document dump, but half of it is still a secret. This single fact has activists and survivors arguing that any conclusion being drawn right now is, fundamentally premature. So what's actually in the part we can see? Well, it's a mix of photos, videos, and court records. But here's the catch. Even within those 3 million pages, there are just thousands and thousands of forward actions, big black boxes covering up names and key details. It's like trying to read a book with half the words blacked out. It's a story full of holes.
Naturally, a ton of the focus has been on the big names that have popped up. So let's turn to one of the most visible figures, former President Donald Trump, and see how he's responded to all this.
Trump's response was, let's just say, immediate. He came out swinging, declaring total absolution, and framing the whole thing as a political hit job. I mean, you can see his quote right here. He claims it shows a writer was conspiring with Epstein to hurt him, completely shifting the focus to this personal political battle.
And he is absolutely doubling down on this defense. It's not just public statements. He's also started threatening to sue people who continue to link him to Epstein. It's a very, very aggressive strategy to control the narrative. And this really shows you the two completely different ways people are looking at this. While Trump is laser-focused on a personal plot against him, a lot of journalists and analysts are saying, whoa, hold on, that's a huge distraction. They argue the real story here isn't about any one person, but about the massive, powerful network that allowed Epstein to operate for so long. And that brings us to the really crucial, much bigger issue. This isn't just about who knew Epstein before he was a known criminal. No, this is about who kept talking to him, who kept associating with him after he was a convicted sex offender.
Let's just look at this timeline for a moment. Epstein pleads guilty way back in 2008, but his influence, it didn't stop there. For years after that, he stayed in touch with a very powerful circle of people. So the big question everyone's asking now is, who were these people and what on earth was the nature of their relationship with a known predator? And his circle was incredibly wide. We are talking about people in the president's inner circle, powerful figures in the media, big names in the news industry, and some very influential people in politics. This just shows how deeply Epstein's network was embedded in the country's most powerful institutions, long after his crimes were public knowledge.
So, with this incredibly messy and incomplete picture, what has the official word from the government been? Well, let's see what the Department of Justice had to say about it all.
And this was the statement that just floored so many people. The Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche announced that after reviewing the files, the DOJ would not be pursuing any new charges. For a lot of folks, it felt like a door being slammed shut on any chance of further accountability.
Now, the DOJ's position is that their decision was based on reviewing those 3 million pages that were released. But this is exactly where the fight starts. I mean, can you really close an investigation when you're only looking at half of the evidence? And that question leads us straight to the perspective of Epstein's survivors and their advocates. For them, the DOJ's statement wasn't an answer. It was, frankly, an insult. This is the question they are screaming for an answer to. How can the Department of Justice just declare the review is over when millions of pages are still locked away and thousands of redactions are hiding the truth in what we can see? Activist Danielle Bensky, who's been a huge voice for transparency in all this, she just puts it plainly. She argues that it's simply impossible for the DOJ to make that kind of conclusion. The missing files, the blacked out text, it all means the full scope of Epstein's network is still a mystery. And this quote, wow, it just perfectly captures how survivors feel. The DOJ tried to close the book on this, but it's had the exact opposite effect. It hasn't put out the calls for justice. It has only poured gasoline on the fire, fueling even more anger and suspicion. So, if the official channels are seen as untrustworthy, what's the solution? All this dissatisfaction has led to a major push for something completely different, bringing in outside oversight. And just to add another layer of distrust to the pile, the DOJ was already 40 days late in even releasing these documents, which they were required to do by law. For critics, that delay just makes them even more suspicious that this whole process has been botched from the start. Because of all this, you're hearing louder and louder calls for a third party to step in. And the proposals are really specific. Appoint an inspector general, hire an independent auditor, or maybe even bring in an outside private group. The main idea is simple. We need someone without a horse in this race to review not just the files, but how the DOJ has handled them. And really, this is the question we're all left with. When half the story is kept in the dark, when official conclusions spark outrage, and when trust in the system is totally broken, what does justice even look like? Without full transparency, can there ever be real closure?